Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon to some. Thank you all for joining today on a webinar hosted by me, Chaz Banga, with Cirrus Consulting Group. Just a brief intro to myself. I'm one of the senior consultants here at Cirrus Consulting Group, and typically I advise and represent our firm in these matters when it relates to providing guidance and CE programs on the topic of commercial real estate, the business of dentistry. We have a great topic ahead of us today on the focus of, can your landlord relocate your dental practice? And quite openly, this is a common issue or concern that we find in lease agreements all over the country, but really has a true impact on the bottom line for a dental office and is one of the most outrageous costs a dental office can face. So just openly speaking, anytime that I identify a relocation provision within a dental office lease agreement, it's one of the top priorities to eliminate. As you can imagine, it will incur significant costs to the practice. So we decided today, given the prevalence of relocation clauses in commercial lease agreements, to specifically designate today's program to cover the topic, how to protect ourselves, where to identify the relocation clause, and what options do we have as dental tenants to improve the relocation clause in the interest of protecting our business. So just a little bit of background on myself, because I think that's important for all of you to understand my experience with the business of dentistry. I've been with Cirrus Consulting Group 3 going on 4 years now, really supporting the dental community with educating them and reviewing their leases and providing them guidance on how to better position themselves as it relates to the real estate for the practice. So prior to joining Cirrus, my career started off actually working in the business of dentistry. I was a founder and director of a teeth whitening firm, so was very familiar with the nuances of operating a dental practice, how a product like a teeth whitening service can increase patient attraction to the space, but also simultaneously while working for the teeth whitening firm, I also worked with a landlord development group representing the interests of landlords in their negotiations with tenants. So quite frankly, I have experience on both ends of the stick, representing tenants as well as representing landlords. So part of today's program is leveraging, both sides of my experience and giving you a better understanding of not only your lease agreement, but items within the lease, critical elements, and how to negotiate a better deal, how to negotiate a better lease, how to protect yourself, and really give you a key idea of the impact of a relocation clause and provision. Before I start any program, I always like to give a little bit of background on our firm, who we are, what exactly we do, and how we support the dental community. So we actually started off back in 1994 representing the interests of dentists and other healthcare tenants. So whether you're a veterinarian, a general doctor or practitioner, or a specialist or a dentist, we really have and are equipped to support you with all facets of the real estate arrangements, whether you lease the space, whether you're starting up a practice from scratch, renewing your lease, entertaining your transition, or buying commercial real estate. We're really here to support you. We were founded by a group of dentists a little over 25 years ago to bridge the gap between commercial real estate and healthcare. We are a hyper-specialized and niche firm, as we like to believe, and really our core focus is particularly representing the interests of a unique tenant. Majority of our clients are dentists, and the unique nature of the business of dentistry is entering into dentistry and starting a dental business is arguably one of the most expensive industries to enter into. As many of you can attest towards, very expensive from a leasehold standpoint to build, plumb, equip, and build out that dream practice for the rest of your career. On average, we're looking at about $150 or more for leasehold improvements alone. So we do have a vested interest as a dental tenant in the commercial space in which we're leasing, because we have a lot to lose with an improperly structured lease agreement. So since our inception as a firm, we've negotiated over 10,000 lease agreements all across the country. Again, whether you're starting a practice from scratch, renewing the lease, or planning for a transition, we're really equipped to support you in all facets, regardless of what direction you're planning to go in. In terms of the unique nature of our firm, we're not commercial brokers, so we do not derive a commission when we're involved in a project. We actually operate more so as a legal counsel and a group of attorneys. In terms of our firm, we have an in-house legal counsel which represents and negotiates on behalf of all of our prospective tenants with the negotiations against their landlords. They're supported by our leasing division, which are all comprised of ex-brokers, formal real estate experts who provide us some key financial data as it relates to negotiation. With any negotiation, it's twofold. We have the financial side as well as the legal component. The financial side is often found on the first 1 to 3 pages of the lease agreement. The other 50 or 60 pages are the legal obligation, commitments, and agreements between landlord and tenant and vis-a-vis. So we certainly are properly equipped to address and deal with all matters as it relates to the negotiation. And lastly, we have our consulting division, which is the division that I work with. We spend our time lecturing across the country. All of our consultants have a background in business, real estate, and are equipped to really guide you through the best course of action as it relates to making these big business decisions regarding your office lease agreement, your real estate arrangements, and so on and so forth. But not only do we represent doctors and guide them and advise them through these commercial real estate matters, but we're also providing CE programs like today, whether it's a webinar or a live seminar. We lecture quite extensively all across the country, providing these educational programs to bridge that gap, to ensure that our dental tenants, who are arguably the best tenant a landlord can have, long-term, stable, predictable tenant, are aware of the exact arrangement they're getting themselves into, which is typically for a long period of time. So in addition to providing the CE programs, we're also keynote speakers at some of the major dental conventions, the Greater New York Dental Meeting. For those of you that will be joining the Greater New York this year, we are running a wonderful workshop on commercial real estate, reviewing leases at the program. So do reach out to me if you are planning attending the Greater New York this year. We also lecture at the Pacific Dental Conference, the Yankee Dental Conference, California Dental Association, the Hinman course as well there in Atlanta, Georgia, and many of the major metropolitan dental conventions, because knowledge is power, and it's important that our doctors are aware of exactly what they're getting themselves into, and they're aware and they have a party that is truly giving them feedback and, quite openly, candid feedback on the structure arrangement of the lease agreement. And we work with doctors nationwide. We're not local to a specific market. We represent the interests of doctors all over the country. So with that being said, I'll use that as a segue to my next slide, which is some of our recent clients. Just to give you an idea of the scope of work that we do across the country, we represent the interests of doctors all the way from Hawaii, California, Washington State, right across to the Atlantic, the East Coast, New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, the Floridas, North and South Carolina. And one thing that's great about our legal and leasing team is we're familiar with the legalities of each state, as well as have access to key information as it relates to financials to negotiate favorable rent. So regardless of where you are in the country, our leasing division can pinpoint your location and determine average rental rates, growth trends, fair market value, availability, comparables. But we also, given our experience of being in the business and collecting data of many of our retained clients and doctors we've advised in the past, including over 10,000 past clients, we have cataloged and database over 10,000 lease agreements. So we're aware of dental-specific comps, which is another unique value add that is different than any other partner or real estate partner that you may work with across the country. Given our scope of work across the U.S. as well as Canada, we certainly understand what other dental tenants are paying and can relate that as we negotiate financials, and to ensure that you're getting a great deal on your lease agreement, that your rents are predictable, they're in line with the market, and that you're not overpaying in rent. So part of some of the data, just to give you an idea, I have my leasing team pull up some real estate data across the country, just in some key markets. So to give you an idea here, the yellow line that you're looking at is vacancy rate, while the blue line is rates as it relates to rental rates and average rental rates. So if you'll note here, as vacancy goes down and properties become less available, you'll notice a correlation where rental rates significantly spike. It's simple supply and demand. The less supply in the marketplace, higher cost to rent. So here in Boston, we're seeing rental rates going from $34 back in mid-2016 to well over $44 in the latter stages of 2017. But key to be aware of the market landscape as you negotiate, because it's important for us to understand, what your competitors are paying in rent and what other competitor landlords are asking in rental. So again, another great example here is Chicago, Illinois. Same correlation. Vacancy rates went down and rental rates have subsequently increased. The difference between these two examples, Boston and Chicago, is vacancy rates have gone from 16% to 11%, where in Boston we're seeing them get well below 7%. So again, in Chicago, you'll see here that rental rates have spiked, but they're still available properties. Orlando, Florida, again, rental rates are on a steady incline. We've noted that rental rates are about $23, vacancy hovering around 8%. And then San Francisco, again, this is based on a specific area in San Francisco. Rental rates on the Northwest have significantly skyrocketed, and we're seeing a very low vacancy rate. Properties are hard to come by. They're not as accessible as they previously were. Landlords are leasing their spaces. There's high demand. As a result, rental rates have skyrocketed as an impact. But key to note that some of these key concessions and key items are based on rental rates and what is available in the marketplace, so that when we go in for the ask and the negotiation on rates, we're aware of what the market is indicating. So what's the purpose of today's webinar? Number one, the purpose is to give you a better understanding of commercial real estate, the business of dentistry, and how the two interrelate. But specifically, we'll discuss the relocation clause and the impact that it can have on the practice. The relocation clause and seeing a relocation provision is quite honestly one of the worst type of provisions to have in any lease agreement. It is an immediate red flag when our legal and leasing team does an analysis of your lease agreement. It is a provision that is very often puts the practice at risk. It really leaves the practitioner, you the doctor, in a volatile state. At any point in time, the landlord can arbitrarily invoke the relocation provision, which, quite frankly, can be detrimental to the business. Forcibly having to move from one space within the business center to another space can have significant consequences to the practice, and, in some cases can completely deteriorate the value of a business. So again, we'll discuss the impact of the relocation clause. We'll also discuss what to do in the event of an unexpected relocation and your rights as a tenant. And having spoken with many doctors across the country, which I typically do on a daily basis, I always point out that these type of issues are often found in large retail centers. And for me, when I'm advising a doctor, I always request them and say, hey, doctor, if you're a new grad or an associate that's starting their business for the first time or venturing out into the world and starting your first practice, have very little reputation in the community and are looking to do that by starting a business, do so in a retail strip plaza, an area where there's large traffic flow, high visibility, high anchor tenants, such as a Walmart, a Starbucks, a Costco, or some large grocer. It means that there's going to be a lot of traffic flow. You'll have a larger patient pool to draw from. However, the caveat with those type of arrangements is quite often the lease agreement provides the landlord with flexibility to arbitrarily move any of the tenants at their disposal. Again, for a dental tenant, very costly to go through a relocation. I'll dig deeper into that later in the program as we move forward, but really, as I just want to point out and we'll continue to reiterate, relocation provisions, particularly in a retail strip plaza, are not the ideal type of provision. So in addition to identifying, giving you guidance on what to do if you go through an unexpected relocation. I'll also point out today how to identify this clause in your lease agreement, how to improve the clause if you're unable to remove it, which is in the favor of you as a tenant and not the landlord. I'll also discuss how to set up the relocation clause so that the landlord is responsible for paying all moving costs, such as demolition and renovation clauses. So at a high level, just to go over what a relocation clause is, it's a specific term within a lease agreement that allows the landlord to pick you up and move you on a certain period of notice to another part of the center. What that means is you would have to completely break down your practice, move all your chairs, equipment, but also go through the formal process of rebuilding into another site within the plaza, retail strip setting, or professional building. So very costly to go through a relocation, so we certainly want to be aware of the consequences, how to identify it, who's responsible, and how we can change the onus to the landlord to cover all costs and responsibilities. And lastly, we'll cover off how to negotiate lease termination rights into the lease in the event that the new space is inadequate. If the landlord is taking you from 2,000 square feet down to 1,500 square feet, which means a loss in operatories, which means less ability to produce productively from the business of dentistry, we'll discuss how to terminate the lease agreement in the event of an unexpected relocation to another space that does not fit your business needs or requirements. So I always like to really focus in the program on a question. It's a very open question. I'll give you all a moment to think about it. But when I speak of leasing, what is the first thing that comes to mind when I say, what is a lease? And I'll always ask this question at my live seminars, and I'll get a number of varying answers regarding of what a lease agreement specifically is. You know, a lot of doctors will say it's an agreement, it's a binding contract, it's your obligation to the landlord. Some doctors will say it's a nightmare. And a lot of doctors will also say it's rent. And quite openly, the right answer is a lease agreement is a contract between you and the landlord indicating the amount that you will spend on rent to them and the responsibilities you have. And the reality is, if we take away the agreement itself, the relationship we're establishing is based on value, rent. And again, rent is the second highest expense a practice incurs next to wages to employees and their staff. So it is a significant cost that you do bear as a tenant in a property and as a business owner. And the example that I always like to use to make you clear of the exact rent obligation is typically based on the average rent for a 2,000 square foot practice. So I had my leasing and legal division pull up a perspective of average rents for a 2,000 square foot space all across the country. And we came to the conclusion that on average, in today's marketplace, average rent for a 2,000 square foot space is about $5,000 in base rent every month without additionals, just base rent alone. On an annual basis, that will equate out to $60,000 in rent. Wonderful. We're committing ourselves to $60,000 in costs in order to operate our business out of the space. On average, a dentist will sign a lease agreement for 10 years. So let's say, hypothetically, rent stays flat, which we all know is not typically the case. Rents typically escalate in line with the marketplace on average of about 3% year over year. But just in the purpose of my example, let's say average rent stays flat at $5,000 a year for a 10-year period. Based on that assumption, we're looking at a $600,000 rent obligation. On average, the career of a dentist spans for 30 years. So if we multiply our $600,000 obligation by 30 years, we're looking at a $1.8 million contract. We are committing to the landlord $1.8 million in cost to occupy, to be a tenant in a space. So we certainly want to ensure that the lease agreement works in our favor given the nature of the business of dentistry. It's a significant cost to enter into and start a business. There is a significant cost attributed to leasehold improvements that are built into the physical infrastructure of the property. We are long-term tenants. We are predictable. We pay our rents on time, and we're typically there for 30 years, committing a large value to the landlord. As such, it does provide you as a tenant with leverage in the negotiation. You as a dentist do have great leverage to negotiate a wonderful deal. Landlords need predictability. That is what you provide. So if we're going to be committing this significant value in the form of rent, we certainly need to ensure that the lease agreement works as an asset rather than a liability. So moving forward, why is the office lease important? Why is the office lease so important to you as a dental tenant? Well, there's a number of reasons why the office lease is vital to the dental office. Number one, your office location is the foundation of your practice. Where your practice is located is critical, whether it's in a high-dense area, a rural area, but you're essentially servicing the local community. And it's critical that your space is accessible, available, and that the tenants, that the clients, your prospective patients, are able to identify where you're located, because typically once a patient finds and identifies a good dentist to work with, they will forever remain a client of that doctor as long as they're within a near proximity and are accessible to where the client lives or where their office is or where their work environment is. But key to know that the office location is the foundation of your practice. When you're looking at a build out of a practice, a fresh start build out, you're looking at $150 a square foot in leasehold improvements alone. So before we ever even open the doors to patients, we as a dentist need to build in, put in plumbing, put in electrical, and demise out our dental business. Very costly undertaking. On average, we're looking at rates used to be about $100 a square feet, but we're starting to see escalations in that. On the low side, maybe $125 a square foot. On the high side, about $200 a square foot. So on average, we'll say about $150 a square foot. For a 2,000 square foot practice, which is the average size 4 to 5 op practice, we're looking at a significant investment into the property. A $300,000 investment. Before we ever open up the doors for business, we're committing ourselves to $300,000 in build-out costs, which are fixed and become property of the landlord. Key to note that as you affix items to the premises of the landlords and their property, it effectively becomes their property. So it's critical via the lease agreement that we outline which items belong to the tenant, which items are landlord property, so that when we do get the practice appraised and ultimately plan for our exit, it's clear who has ownership to white items. So there's a significant cost and investment to build out the practice, as I mentioned. It's also very difficult, expensive, and time-consuming to move and uproot the business. On average, we'll see the process take anywhere from 6 months to a year or sometimes longer, depending on if you have identified a site and if that site is zoned or usable for a dental practice or a healthcare tenant. So on average, we'll see, once we identify a site and go through the motions of opening the doors for patients, that process is a long time and a significant period from beginning to end. So critical that the lease works in our favor and we are not arbitrarily evicted from the site or forced into default, because it is very expensive, time-consuming to pick up and move the business. And lastly, the lease agreement has broad implications on our ability to ultimately transition and sell the practice. In order to go through the motions of selling the practice, we need to go through a formal process of assigning the lease agreement. As part of our due diligence and offering is to look at the assignment and subleasing provision to note if the lease agreement works in your favor and to see if you're actually able to assign and transfer the lease. For a dental practice, which I'll discuss next, is unique in the sense that how a practice goes through the motion of sale. We get the practice appraised, negotiated letter of intent, purchase and sale agreement letter of intent, which is contingent on transfer of lease. Without a lease agreement, we cannot transfer the lease. Without a lease agreement, we cannot transfer the practice to another party. We absolutely need to have, number one, term on the lease agreement. Number two, a transferable lease. So one that works in our favor, that has clear assignment language when we're ready to ultimately sell, and sell not only our patient charts, our goodwill, but also our equipment and the lease space. So with that being said, it's important for you all to understand what the three sellable components of your practice are. We work very closely with some of the large practice appraisal groups. We'll typically advise them and provide due diligence on the merits of the lease agreement and the transferability of that agreement. But before we can evaluate a sale, we need to understand what are the components that are involved in the appraisal. So first and foremost, we'll get an appraisal of the leasehold improvement, the equipment that is. So we'll take a look at the depreciated value of the equipment. How much currently is the value of the equipment? Is it state-of-the-art? Is it new? Is the equipment digital? And quite stages of your career and evaluating your transition, and within that last 5 years before you ultimately exit out of the business of dentistry, I would absolutely encourage you to invest into new technology and equipment. You will recuperate the value in the ultimate sale as a new buyer inherits and acquires your business. But in terms of buyer pool, doctors that are associates, new grads, associates that have worked a few years in a dental practice and are now in the buyer pool of acquiring a turnkey dental practice would much prefer a practice that is up to date within modern standards, and you as a selling doctor will most certainly obtain value for the new and quality of your dental practice. So first and foremost, when we appraise a practice, we take a look at the depreciated value of the equipment. Secondarily, we'll take a look at the goodwill, the patient charts. And goodwill is a term that's loosely turned around and thrown around in the healthcare industry. So many people are, they think that goodwill is simply patient. In some form that is correct, but the reality is what goodwill truly means is the revenue per patient per year. How much income, how many procedures, and how often is the patient coming back in a given year. And once we understand what the appraised value of the goodwill is, we'll be better positioned to understand what the overall value of the practice is. Typically, in some markets, we'll see practice being appraised at about 60, 70, or 80% of gross revenue. But the reality is the space, the lease also factor into the value of the business. So with that being said, the lease agreement, the rental rates, and the terms and conditions within it have valuation. It puts the prospective buyer at risk from taking over the business and getting forced into relocation and being forced into incurring additional costs to rebuild in another space within the center. So we certainly want to ensure that the lease agreement has elements within it that add value rather than detract value. Now, by no means is this pie chart, relevant to the percentages related to the valuation of the business. But what I did really want to point out is that the lease agreement does have 100% impact on the valuation of the business. If we're unable to transfer the lease agreement to a prospective buyer, then the reality is that we're getting a nominal value for the practice. It can completely negate the value of the business. You'll get a nominal value of selling just patient records and charts. You may get some value from selling individual pieces of equipment, but the true and maximum value that you can derive from a practice is selling the 3 key items: selling the goodwill, selling the equipment that's involved, as well as transferring the lease and all the items that are built into the lease, including leasehold improvements. So we certainly want to ensure that all these elements are working in our favor so that we ultimately plan for our exit or well strategize for that. So what should your office lease do for you? Well, the office lease should do a number of things for you. Number one, it should provide you with fair and affordable financial terms. Rents should be based on fair market value. Escalations should be based on CPI. We want to ensure that our rents aren't getting exorbitant, that we have rights at the renewals to renegotiate rent, to re-understand based on the current market landscape as to what we will be paying in the future on our rental rate. Important to get rental rates right from the beginning. If we get it right from the beginning or upon a renewal, then we're certainly in position to have predictable rent in the future. But when we evaluate rental rates, we're not just looking at base rent. For those of you that are currently leasing your space that are into today's program, I'm certain that many of you are aware of triple net cost. Triple net cost being additional tacked on to base rental rate, whether that's taxes, maintenance, or insurance, or a combination of the three. It is an additional cost to you as a tenant when you are operating your dental business. So part of what we look to structure when we're looking to provide fair and affordable financial terms is not only reasonable base rent, but controls on CAM costs. So common area maintenance, which are part of the triple net cost, is typically an area for a landlord to manipulate and take advantage of the tenant by not providing invisibility or providing transparency as to what those costs are. So we have our base rent, and throughout the year the landlord provides maintenance of the property, whether that's landscaping, snow removal in some states, drywall, parking maintenance, and things along those lines. We certainly want to ensure that we are getting a statement breaking down and itemizing the exact cost incurred by the landlord, but we're also given the ability to audit that statement to validate whether the costs are being overcharged or whether the landlord is being consistent as to what they are charging you and what they're actually paying. And additional costs are typically paid out based on your prorated square footage. So what typically occurs is we would determine what your square footage is in relation to the landlord's square footage. So if we take a 1,000 square foot space in a 10,000 square foot property, we're looking at 10% of occupancy costs related to area maintenance costs. You as a tenant will be responsible for $14,000 of those costs. So if we do not have a check and balance built into place, very difficult to have fair and affordable financial terms. So just to reiterate, what we would like to receive at the end of the year is a reconciliation statement breaking down and itemizing the costs incurred by the landlord, as well as a right to audit that statement to ensure that it is consistent. Number two, the lease should provide you with long-term stability and security. Very simple. We have a significant investment in the property. We're long-term tenants. Our patients are aware of where we're located, and we continuously need to operate in that space to ensure that our patient pool is coming to us for their service needs. So we certainly want to ensure that we're receiving a 10-year lease like long-term leases. That's what they're in the business for, to lock down tenants for as long as possible, for as much rent as possible. But what we look to achieve when we're involved in the negotiation is, get favorable terms and conditions on the rents, but provide the landlord with the predictability of our tenancy and that we will be in the space for many, many years. We also need to take in consideration our exit strategy. In order to ever sell the dental business, if the practice is doing north of $500,000 in revenue and is appraised of north of $500,000, then we certainly need to ensure that we have clear assignment language that reflects a change in ownership of the lease, but also that there's adequate term in the form of years on the lease agreement. In order for the banks to qualify a prospective buyer for lending, they will require a minimum of 5 years of term in order to amortize. And you're ready to sell for $1 million, let's say $1.2 million, your prospective associate or buyer of the business will go to a banker, whether that's Wells Fargo, Bank of America, Affinity Bank, Chase Bank, some of the large institutional bankers, and look to secure financing. And the banks will say, wonderful, we need to see a copy of the lease agreement and the merits within it. And the first item they look at is remainder of term. So if they're providing you a loan, they want to ensure that the space that you're renting will be available to you so that you can continue to occupy that space for the remainder of your career, but also pay back the debt to the lenders. Number 3 is we want to minimize our risk and exposures. What does that mean? Minimize risk and exposure. That sounds wonderful. I'm certain everybody wants to minimize their risk and exposure. Very simply put, we want to ensure that the lease agreement is signed through some veil of protection, a corporate entity that you need to be separate personally from the lease agreement so that your personal name is not attached to the lease. And what occurs is if you do provide some form of a personal guarantee, in the event of default or dispute with the landlord, and the landlord is unable to recuperate damages from the practice PC or LLC, they can go after directly to the tenant. They can go and look to receive all damages, all future rents from the tenant in the event of default or dispute. So going forward, for those of you that have not taken a look at your lease agreement, be sure to understand whether you've signed the lease agreement through your personal name, whether it's through a corporate entity, and whether you provide a separate agreement indicating a personal guarantee. Typically at the beginning of our dental careers, we're often in debt, have a very low asset base. But as our career goes on, our assets increase, our debt decreases to a point where we have very little to no debt and significant assets. Much more critical in the latter stages of your career, mid-career doctor or transitioning doctor, to remove the lease agreement from any personal guarantee or personal covenant. It is a risk to you yourself, it's a risk to your family, a risk to your state. I was speaking with a doctor this morning, actually the doctor's estate and family. Unfortunately, the doctor had passed away from an extreme case of lymphoma. But what essentially occurred was the doctor had identified a great and wonderful site. He submitted an offer on the space, went through the formal motions of a lease agreement, provided a personal guarantee, but then also defaulted on the lease agreement within a few weeks. Prior to the practice being fully built out, he had incurred about $600,000 in costs and unfortunately passed away from his lymphoma. The estate was held liable to pay rent for a year and a half. Even though they were not dentists, even though they had no involvement with the dental business, because they were heirs to the estate, they inherited all assets as well as all liability. So the lease agreement being a significant liability and burden to the family, it wasn't a pretty picture to deal with. We also want to maximize our flexibility. Add items like a death and disability provision. God forbid something happens to you as a tenant, we certainly want to ensure that there's an exit strategy there. We also have a right of first refusal to expand in the event that there's an adjacent space available. But lastly, we want to enhance our ability to transfer the lease, and that's conducted through the assignment and transfer language. Ensure that we're providing no guarantees, that we're able to sell to another licensed dental practitioner in your state or province, and that we have a clear path that when we're ready to ultimately exit, there is a defined process in place for us to assign and transfer the lease and remove ourselves from any liability. Let me begin again with the landlord's right to relocate the premises. Again, this is an item that's found in about 50% of office lease agreements, typically in a retail strip plaza setting, where there's a large anchor tenant, there's a sophisticated real estate investment trust that is the landlord. They want to have flexibility to move and shuffle tenants all across the property to accommodate some of their larger tenants. We've seen this quite often with groups like, Starbucks wanting a dentist space. The dentist occupies the wonderful end cap unit with wonderful visibility. And then the landlord, has been approached by a Starbucks type group or, a grocery type group saying, hey, we want that site, otherwise we will not move into the property. And unfortunately, it comes to the disarray of the dental tenant. The landlord will invoke their right to relocate the tenant, and all of a sudden the dentist is forced to close their practice and forced to move to another part of the center, which may not be the ideal type scenario. There's timelines involved in rebuilding and moving equipment. But again, with the business of dentistry, we're not your average tenant. The average tenant, an accountant, a lawyer, a nail salon, a barber shop, a bookstore, or things along those lines, very easy and quick for them to relocate. It's a matter of a weekend to pick up their equipment, their supplies, their tables, unplug their computers, and move it to the new center or location. Unfortunately, that's not the reality for a dentist. The reality is for a dentist is that it's very expensive, time-consuming to rebuild and retrofit the space, the new space, and go through plumbing, site plans, electrical, and all that's involved in relocating a dental practice. So we certainly, as a dental tenant, want to ensure that going forward, we do not have a relocation provision in place here. So number one, let's avoid the relocation clause altogether. The language that we'll often see, as you can see based on this example, is the new premises shall be substantially the same in size. The word substantially is ambiguous to me, and it's hard to decipher what constitutes as substantially. For example, if substantially means we're in a 2,000 square foot space today, but going down to 1,500, what issue or concern might that cause to us as a dental tenant? What it does is it takes away from our space. We'll lose an operatory, we'll lose production and revenue, or we'll have a more crammed waiting room or no business space for us to have an office space, which can cause a problem. What if we go in the other direction? All of a sudden we go from a 2,000 square foot space to a 25 or greater space, which is quote unquote substantially the same size. Now all of a sudden our occupancy costs have gone up. Because we pay rent per square foot, the more square footage we occupy, our higher rent obligation will be. So we certainly want to ensure that we dimension, if the relocation provision will persist in the lease, dimension what exactly substantially means. And if the case may be that, the landlord is offsetting any cost, whether we go bigger or providing some inducement if they're reducing our size. But again, not ideal. We certainly want to remove all these liabilities altogether. Number two, the physical relocation of the premises shall be accomplished by landlord at landlord's cost, and all costs shall be paid by landlord in a sum not to exceed $1,000. Wonderful. Our practice is getting relocated, and all that the landlord is contributing is $1,000. Now, I'm sure many of you wish that you were able to build your practice for $1,000. I'm certain that's not the case, and quite openly, getting a design file for a space is far greater than $1,000. Even picking up and moving the equipment is far greater than $1,000. What this provision does is it really prevents the landlord from taking responsibility towards the cost of relocating their dental office. Not ideal. It's critical that when we go through the negotiations of a relocation, we ensure the landlord is aware of the costs that are involved in building out a dental suite, what it truly means to build out a state-of-the-art dental practice. And once they're aware of what it costs, they'll be sure not to include that in a lease agreement or negotiate that term or amend that provision out of the agreement. So I'll give you a great example here. We dealt with a doctor, Jessica B. We'll keep her last name anonymous for confidentiality purposes. But Dr. B out of Tampa, Florida, had 2 years until her lease renewal deadline. She had an unresponsive landlord. She retained our group to represent her. We bring the landlord to the table to negotiate. And then all of a sudden the landlord decides to revoke their relocation clause and move Dr. B to another site within the property. And then we adjust our negotiation strategy to facilitate a safe and smooth relocation. And we ensure that the landlord covered all build-out costs. But it's important that we have that provision built into the lease agreement, that in the event that, God forbid, the landlord does invoke their relocation right, that we, as a dental tenant, are covered, that the landlord will cover all costs, including build-out, to bring the space back into a similar quality, including all stationery, marketing, ensure that the landlord is moving all the equipment and giving us a timeline whereby we're able to move into the space without having any downtime. Downtime kills a dental practice. Attrition occurs, it magnifies very quickly and multiplies exponentially as weeks go on. So there needs to be a rule built into the lease agreement that if the landlord does want to have a relocation clause in their lease, that their landlord cannot terminate or evict us from our space until the new relocated space is built to the quality that we desire on the new site. So really, what with our experience here with Dr. B is we really helped her and assisted her with the relocation when the landlord did force her into another site, but we also saved her almost $800,000 in build-out costs, moving equipment over $250,000, significant burden and cost to her. We ended up saving her a significant value in rent alone, so great negotiation occurred for her and Dr. B. And some of the achievements, just to give you a high-level overview, when a doctor did go through the process of relocating and having proper and professional representation from a group that is aware of the merits of a relocation and what that costs a dental tenant, we secured her a 10-year and 2 5-year deals, saved her over $250,000. We amended the relocation clause to prevent it from ever happening in the future, ensured that the new suite was of comparable size, visibility, and accessibility. We negotiated that the landlord cannot terminate the lease agreement in the event that Dr. B assigns the agreement. So there was transfer language. We prepared the doctor for a subsequent sale of the business. We prevented the doctor from ever being charged any proceeds of sale and really managed her family and estate's liability and protected them throughout the process. So key to be aware that if a relocation clause exists in your lease, that there's alternative options built into the agreement where we can better protect you as a tenant, ensure that you as a tenant cannot be forced to cover all the costs that are involved in relocating yourself and moving to another space because you have that provision in your lease. So very successful negotiation and great win for everyone. But it's more than just the relocation provision that we take a look at. It's one of the facets, arguably one of the most onerous terms in any lease agreement. But when we get involved in the negotiations, we'll evaluate every piece and part of the lease. How that impacts you, is it designed in your favor? And quite openly, lease agreements are designed in the favor of the landlord. And we certainly, and I'm a firm believer of level the playing field, establishing a lease agreement that is favorable to both parties, but going through and reviewing all items and merits of the lease agreement. The assignment, demolition clause, relocation, death and disabilities, insurance provision, personal guarantees, vacancies. When we analyze a lease agreement, which we analyze thousands every year, we ensure that every part of the lease is getting reviewed, understanding the position you have as a tenant with regards to the relationship to the landlord and whether the term is favorable or unfavorable. So key to be aware, and this is a key slide in today's program, because it does cover at a high level some of the terms and conditions we look to negotiate on behalf of our dental tenants. So in order to really have a successful negotiation, it's important we're aware of the tenant lease cycle. You know, when to begin the process, when that process starts, what is the key timing to get a good result? As we know, as we all may know or come to appreciate, it's very difficult to pick up and move the dental practice. You typically, as I mentioned earlier, it takes anywhere from 6 months to a year from idea to conception and moving the business. As such, landlords are aware of that. They realize that the closer and closer they get you to the expiration date or the option to renew deadline, the less leverage you have as a dental tenant in achieving a favorable result from the negotiation. Landlords realize that the closer they get you to the expiration date, they can back you into a corner and really present you a take it or leave it deal. Whether that's an increase in rent or a increase in the liabilities of the lease agreement, if we're forced or boxed into the corner with 4 months to go before expiration and are unable to relocate the business, then we're really in a position where it's difficult to win the negotiation. With that being said, the ideal time and window to start negotiations is 24 months before expiration. Begin the process early, begin it often. Be aware of your critical dates. There's 2 critical dates we evaluate. One being the true expiration date. Typically correlates with the end of the year, December 31st of 2019, December 31st of 2020, which means when your lease will formally terminate. The other date to be cognizant about is the option to renew deadline. The option to renew deadline is a period anywhere from 3, 6, 9, or 12 months before the true expiration date, where we need to mention to the landlord or notify them that we are not planning on renewing or that we're planning on renewing and the terms and conditions that we're planning on renewing on. But important that you begin that process early in order to get a best result. Maximum leverage begins 24 months prior to expiration. As soon as we hit that 1 year window, you know, we're really playing into the landlord's goal and objective, which is to get you close to the deadline so they can present you with any deal. So again, key to begin that process early, begin it often. And if any of you would like, I'm happy to validate the key critical dates of any of your lease agreements. So, you know, just at a high level, thank you all for joining today's program. I know it's a little bit past our slotted time here, but since we had that technical difficulty a little bit earlier, I'll run a few minutes past the timeline here. So part of joining today's program and attending today's webinar is that we'll provide you with a wonderful value add. We'll provide you with a $1,500 value in the form of a complimentary lease review. Our legal and leasing team will review all of the legal documents pertaining to the real estate. You know, any original lease agreements, assignment documents, extensions, modifications, amendments, or riders. We'll do a thorough analysis to understand where your liability relates to any of those specific provisions, but also to determine if you're overpaying in rent. We'll then identify and understand what your goals and visions are for the long-term future. You know, what your ultimate transition plan timeline looks like. Do you plan on expanding, remodeling, bringing on associates, or opening up multiple practice? So setting up a vision plan as well as understanding the lease. Then we'll understand the traps that we've uncovered and present to you what impact that can have to you. As you can see from today's program, the relocation clause does have significant burden to you as a tenant. It can absolutely wipe away the practice if there's downtime, if the landlord is expecting you to cover the cost of the relocation. You can imagine the pain you'll feel when all of a sudden 5 years into your lease, after having built a $500,000 or $1 million practice, that you're forced to do it again in the same center at a not so favorable space. So key to understand and uncover what is in the lease agreement, its impact to you as a tenant. Then we'll understand and provide you with the ideal lease plan. How to structure the lease agreement to protect your interest, how to structure the lease agreement to follow and run in parallel with your long-term career plan and trajectory, and really establish ultimate sell goal and transition plan. The assignment and subletting provision, I encourage all of you to review that if you do get an opportunity, and to understand what exactly are your obligations, what are your commitments as it relates to the assignment and transfer of the lease. And the reality is, and the goal here with any assignment and subletting process is to minimize landlord interference, to ensure the landlord is not receiving any increases in rent based on the assignment and providing consent, ensuring that the landlord is not providing or expected to receive any proceeds of sale from the sale of the business, and really ensure that the landlord is providing a straightforward process and a clear plan as to our exit game. Because with the dental practice, we're not just assigning the lease in the space, we're also transferring patients, we're also transferring and selling equipment, which all is a function of the purchase and sale agreement and the lease agreement. And lastly, we'll provide you with a tactical plan, how to negotiate a better lease, how to get a better result, when to begin the process, how to broach the topic. So for those of you in attendance today that are interested in setting up the complimentary lease review, I'm happy to do so. My contact information can be found here. So there essentially is a timeline on the complimentary status of the review. We will place a 2-week timeline, which means at the end of the month, before October 1st, we'll be able to provide you this value add on a complimentary basis. Happy to do so. And all I need on your end is a copy of the lease agreement with any supporting documents. You can either email them or fax them to me. My contact details are here, jbanga@cirrusconsultinggroup.com, or my direct line, 1-866-739-9075, extension 3247. Happy to go over everything with you and review your lease. Again, it's a $1,500 value. We'll do so on a complimentary basis. All I need from you is mention that you attended today's webinar, a copy of all the related documents, and the availability of yourself in the next week or two. So with that being said, thank you all for joining me today on today's program regarding relocation and the lease agreement. I'm hoping that all of you came out with some value here. We certainly want to avoid any relocation clauses in our lease agreement, but I'm glad that I was able to provide guidance on, if the relocation persists, what step downs and alternative options do we have so that you as a dental practitioner aren't completely liable for the relocation. Let's have landlord get involved here. Let's ensure that the landlord is removing the relocation provision, or at the very least amending them, and let's understand your position as a tenant on items like relocation, assignment, death and disability, business use. These are all items within the lease we look to negotiate and amend. So again, thank you all very much so for joining me today. My name is Jazz Banga. Please feel free to reach out to me. My contact details are here. For those of you, again, interested in the lease review, just shoot me a message and I'll coordinate that with you accordingly. So thanks again. Take care, everyone.